Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Opposing Preemption Bills in the 88th Legislative Session, supporting local government's efforts toward equity, safety, and advancement. My name is Gabriella McDonald, and I am Deputy Director here at Texas Appleseed. Today, we are going to talk about preemption and some of the bills that are up in the legislative session. So today's webinar, like I said, we will do a brief introduction about who Texas Appleseed is. Our other presenters will introduce themselves and their organizations when we get to that point. We will define preemption. We'll talk about what bills are at issue, and then we will have an opportunity to talk about some specific issues that these preemption bills will be addressing and interfering with. After that, we'll have time for some Q&A. We'll give people an opportunity to get involved and have a call to action, and then we'll open it one more time for questions and answers. So just a little bit about Texas Appleseed. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that's mission is to promote social, economic, and racial justice for all Texans by leveraging the skills and resources of volunteer lawyers, other professionals, and community partners to identify practical solutions to difficult systemic problems. I know that's a mouthful. What that really means is that we work on policy change on a wide variety of issues on the state and local levels mainly, but also a little bit federally. Just a little bit more about us for background. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. Our work is focused on research and data-driven change. We have attorneys and researchers and many other professionals like public policy people on our staff. We are supported both in volunteer time and in funds by foundations and donors and general donations from the public. We do not usually take government money so that we can tell the government when things aren't working so well. We are located in Austin, Texas, but we work statewide and we're organized by project area, and we will show you some of those project areas now. These are some of the project areas in which we work, and I will say that if you have questions about any of the issues that we work on, you can check out our staff page on texasappleseed.org and reach out to the appropriate staff member or staff team. And then if you have any questions about any of these issues, specifically regarding the legislative session, you can also visit our website that talks specifically about our legislative priorities with regards to these project areas. So, talking about preemption specifically. So preemption is just a legal doctrine that allows a higher level of government to limit or eliminate the power of a lower level of government to regulate a specific issue. Federally, under the Supremacy Clause, the US Constitution takes precedence over the state and local law. And similarly, cities are creatures of the state, which means state law generally takes precedence over local law. Preemption generally in and of itself is not good or bad. It's just a tool that we use to kind of prioritize which laws take precedence. In Texas, it's just a little bit different because we actually are really, really proud of local rule and giving the opportunity for our vast and diverse state to innovate and create and support its citizens and make sure that local government can respond quickly to local needs. But some of the forms that preemption can take is floor preemption, where basically the higher level of government sets a floor for the issue to the lower level of government. And so a good example of that is the minimum wage. You know, the minimum wage is set by the federal government. States cannot, and localities cannot set a wage that is minimum, that is lower than what the federal wage is. Opposite to that is ceiling preemption, and that's basically where the higher level of government has set the top of where somebody can do something. For example, again, if we're taking the minimum wage, several states in recent years have set a max of what the minimum wage can be that cities and counties could set in their own localities. Last but not least is vacuum preemption, where it's basically that the higher level of government says that lower level of governments cannot regulate a certain area, but that higher level of government also has not regulated that certain area, which means there is no regulation happening in that area. Specific to Texas, we know that Texas goes for narrow preemption, and it's got to be express and explicit. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in relation to home rule, which is what makes Texas a little bit different. Next slide. So in 1912, the Texas Constitution, voted on by the citizens of Texas, introduced the Home Rule Amendment, which gave cities over 5,000 inhabitants the power to adopt their own charter after an election, which basically means the power to self-govern. And this results in, it's presumed that cities have the power to legislate unless the state has expressly removed that power. And under case law, that express removal of power has to be unmistakably clear, or if a city ordinance conflicts with an existing state law. So basically what this means is Texas is not really built for field preemption, which is what some of these laws are seeking to do in this legislative session. Field preemption is basically where you take an entire area of the law and say that cities and counties completely cannot address that. And it's not built for that specifically because the citizen legislature meets every 2 years for 5 months, which means that if something happens outside of the legislative session, the legislature can't respond to that. And if you prevent cities and counties from responding to that, citizens are kind of left in the lurch, right? Also, our state is very vast and diverse. How we deal with floods and drought in Lubbock may be totally different to how we deal with floods and drought in Beaumont, and cities need to be able to address those vast differences. And then, like I said, we have a strong tradition of local control. Local control and putting things at a higher level of government is completely contrary to the history of how Texas has governed over the last 100 years or so. So talking specifically about this legislative session, the Texas State Legislature has increasingly used preemption to protect the power and financial interests of established political or commercial entities and thwart local jurisdictions' efforts to adopt laws that advance equity and better serve local residents. What this really means is we are, if we pass these preemption laws, it's going to be usurping local democracy. Yes, state government is elected, but so is local government. These local citizens and local residents have elected local policymakers who have made promises to make the changes that will serve their area. We're preventing innovation. So one of the greatest places that we can kind of test run regulations and rules is through cities and counties. It also gives us an opportunity to think about how we will test run rules and regulations that are equitable and just across the board. We can kind of start to see, is this serving people equitably? And if it's not, we get the opportunity to tweak it on small scale before we move it to a larger scale. And then last but not least, we are punishing local officials and governments with some of these preemption bills. And you will see what I mean when I talk specifically about the preemption bills that are up this session next. So here are some of the bills that we are specifically talking about. The biggest one, the one that everybody is discussing and has been quoted in the media as the Death Star bill, is HB 2127 and its companion SB 814. Basically, this gives the state exclusive authority over anything governed by the following codes, and that can include the Agriculture Code, finance, insurance, labor, natural resources, occupations, property, and business and commerce. You will see that property code and business and commerce are in this teal color because it was added in a committee substitute. So if you were to go to Texas Legislature online right now and look at the original bill, those two wouldn't be included. But when the bill came up for hearing last Wednesday, these two codes were added to that. This is what we call field preemption and what Texas is not built to do, which is completely eliminate any area of governance for cities and counties in these areas. And that can include anything from how cities and counties have traditionally regulated fireworks or overgrown lots or predatory lending, as we'll talk about in more detail here, or employment discrimination under the labor code, uncontrolled burns and waste storage under the natural resources code. Issues like the Crown Act that Austin passed recently may be at issue, lawn maintenance. So there's a number of things that we're just not sure exactly how this is going to affect, but we know that if they completely preempt all of these areas, there's a lot that cities and counties currently regulate that are going to be eliminated, and the state doesn't regulate them currently. And so we're going to have that vacuum preemption happen if this bill passes. I mentioned the punishment of local officials. Any taxpayer adversely affected by whatever ordinance that is at issue here can file a suit against the city or county seeking a declaratory judgment and cost and attorney's fees. And it also removes immunity from lawsuits for localities so that they can then be sued. The previous version of the bill, again, the one originally filed, stated that it could be filed in any county, but now it's in the county related to the case or an adjacent county. So under the previous bill, if you had, a Galveston citizen who wanted to file a lawsuit in, I don't know, far East Texas, they could have and required the, city attorney for Galveston to go to far East Texas to deal with this lawsuit. But apparently they changed that in the cities, in the committee substitute. So that is the big bill, and that's the big one that most people are concerned about. But there are a lot of other smaller areas that really also kind of deal with this. So if you go to the next slide, we will talk about the next bills. So HB 2035 and its companion SB 986 would prohibit cities and counties from regulating evictions that are regulated currently under the Texas Property Code. HB 4815 would do the same thing as above, but instead of using the property code, they use the local government code to say that cities and counties can't regulate evictions. HB 2226 talks specifically about license holders, and that could be any license holder because it's very broadly worded. So basically it says that any license holder that is adversely economically impacted could file a suit against this city or county that has introduced a requirement or regulation or restriction, and basically they could file suit against that person, against that county or city, and seeking an injunction, a TRO, cost, and attorney's fees, again, kind of punishing local government actors. SB 130 deals specifically with the issue of cities and counties may not adopt or enforce rules and regulations that require an employer in the municipality or county to provide employment benefits. So this includes things like rest breaks and insurance and sick leave. And we know that recently some of the cities like Austin and Dallas have adopted things like rest breaks for construction workers where they're outside in the hot sun for hours on end. And so they're allowed to have a 10-minute break every 4 hours. And regulations like that rest break would be wiped out by this bill. Next. HB 2350 talks about occupational licenses and basically said that cities and states can't do anything that's more stringent than what's required under state law. There are some exceptions that are listed here. Similarly, under SB 149, municipalities cannot restrict, condition, or regulate commercial activity except if there's a unique local concern, there's a local land use issue, you're protecting physical health, or it already requires non-discrimination under state or federal law. And just so you know, in SB 149, when the city issues the restriction or condition or regulation, they have to state what is the unique local concern they're trying to protect when they issue the ordinance. And so otherwise it is going to be invalidated by this law. Next. And so I'd like to introduce specifically Ann Baddour and John Litzler to talk about reining in payday and auto title lending abuses and the the interaction of preemption and payday and auto title loans. So Ann, would you go ahead and start?
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriella, for that amazing introduction. And I'm really excited to have John Litzler here with me to talk about payday and auto title lending in Texas and how these preemption issues interact with abuses at the local community level and reining in abusive practices. John, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, thank you. I'm John Litzler. I'm the General Counsel and Public Policy Director for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. We're a convention of churches all across the state. We have about 5,300 churches who get together for a common mission of sharing Christ and showing love by strengthening churches and engaging the culture.
Great, thanks so much. So I thought it would be helpful to start out doing some level setting about payday and auto title loans for those who may not be familiar with them. So Texas stands out from virtually almost every state in the country, we have some of the worst and most abusive practices. These are quick cash loans, generally due in 2 weeks to 6 months. Under Texas law, there are no restrictions on how these can be offered. So they often carry something called a balloon payment, which means that people who might in a desperate moment borrow $500 will end up paying fees over and over and over again and never pay back the principal of the loan. And so it creates something that we often talk about as a cycle of debt. The cost of these loans, they tend to average 200% APR to 500%, but there's no cap in state law. So what does that mean for a typical borrower? So this is just the average across the whole market. The average $1,000 loan cost more than $2,400 to be repaid. And this is just the average. We've talked with borrowers who have spent thousands and thousands on very low dollar loans and end up defaulting because they're just crushed under the weight of the fees. Typically in the Texas market, a $500 loan will cost between $1,100 and over $3,000 to repay. And so this next slide talks about the impact on Texans. So what does this mean? Well, we know these loans target the most financially vulnerable Texans. And over the past decade, it's led to a drain of more than $16 billion in fees. Over 374,000 Texans have lost their cars. And these are people, again, in desperate straits. So it means they've lost their way to get to work, their way to get to the doctor. And over 58% of the borrowers who are in debt for a longer period of time, 11 months or more, receive Social Security or other government benefits. So what we're seeing overall is that very financially vulnerable Texans are bearing the brunt of these abusive lending practices and losing valuable resources, financial resources, and cars, and really being pulled even deeper into poverty. And with these practices, so why do we have city ordinances in this area? Because this is an area that the state could regulate, and perhaps it would be better if the state regulated it. But the reality is that the state has chosen not to regulate this area over multiple sessions and opportunities to make a step forward and support financially vulnerable Texans. So the result is that all those people who have lost cars and paid paid large amounts of fees, that $16 billion in fees coming from families, it's fallen on the backs of our charities, of our churches, of our nonprofits and cities to pay those fees. And so 49 cities across Texas, and you can see that it's a very diverse list covering $11 million, decided that that wasn't right, that didn't benefit their local economy or families. And so they stood up and they adopted ordinances that put just very basic standards into place. They limit the size of the loan based on the borrower's income, limit the number of times these loans can be rolled over or renewed so people aren't pulled into debt indefinitely, and they require principal repayment with every payment of the loan. So maximum 4 payments, 25% principal repayment with the loan, just to put a little box around them so that the financial harm is not endless. And so I wanted to have a little conversation with John just to get your perspective. Why do you think it's important to protect these ordinances? Because all of the bills that Gabriella talked about, or many of them, would have the effect of preempting these local ordinances.
I think it's important for several reasons. Going back to what Gabriella said, different areas in Texas are unique, and these municipalities have the best knowledge about what regulations are needed for payday and auto title lendings, folks in their area. Some areas of Texas, there aren't a lot of payday lenders because it's a more affluent area of Texas. And other areas of Texas, they are everywhere. These ordinances protect consumers, as you said, 11 million Texans. That's just over a third of all Texans. And they really provide the only reasonable limitations on an industry that otherwise, without these ordinances, basically goes unregulated and unchecked.
And why has the faith community been so actively engaged in it? People might be surprised to see a faith leader coming out and talking about this issue, financial regulation. Why has the faith community been engaged in advocating for for these ordinances, both to adopt them and to protect them?
And I think the answer to that is twofold. There's kind of the theological or philosophical why, and then there's the more practical why. So the theological why is because in scripture, Jesus commands his followers to care for the poor and the vulnerable in their communities. There's a proverb in the Old Testament that says, "He who oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is kind to the needy honors the maker." And so just the notion that the idea would treat people as a means to an end, or that people are something to be exploited for personal financial gain, is contrary to our faith and offensive to our faith. And so I think that's why you see Christians, in particular Baptists, rallying to rein in payday lending abuses. So that's kind of where we stand theologically. But the practical reason is a lot of our churches are affected by this issue. One of our pastors says, if your church has walls and has a benevolence fund, you've been touched or affected by this issue. I think I saw a statistic that 1 in 6 Christians have taken out a payday loan in Texas. And that doesn't include the rest of the population who may not identify as a Christian that still end up at churches seeking help. And so, our pastors have walked alongside people who have lost their cars, who can't pay for groceries or electric bills because they had gotten trapped in this cycle of debt. So several of our churches have even opened up, started micro loan programs to try to help people get out from payday loans. Some of them have even gone and gotten certified as federal credit unions, or created a new entity that would be a church federal credit union to help folks get out of debt. And so I think we've just seen the need and seen the hurt in our communities, and local leaders have gotten involved and responded and rallied and led their local city councils and local government to take action and pass these ordinances.
Thanks for those really amazing insights. And what do you see as the impacts if these ordinances, if one or more of those bills that Gabriella talked about passes, and either it preempts the ordinances altogether or freezes them so no cities can do this, or they can't update their ordinances or other things? What do you feel like the harmful impacts of that would be on communities?
Immediately, we'll start to notice an increase in payday lenders. Before these ordinances went into place, there were, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you know this better than I do, but more payday lenders than Whataburgers and McDonald's combined across our state. And that's been reined in somewhat, particularly in these areas with ordinances. Not that all of the payday lenders have gone away, but that they're not proliferating at the rate they were, where there's, everywhere. But particularly in areas where there are banking deserts or food deserts, we'll just start to see these stores pop up, and they'll drown out some of the other healthier, better options that so many groups, including churches, have been working to present. One of the stories we've heard from a young man who ended up taking out a payday loan. He had walked past a payday loan every day, payday lender every day. And when he fell on hard times, he knew exactly where it was, because they are so, they're everywhere on every corner, it seems like. And so they're easy to find, and they'll drown out some of those healthy alternatives. They'll subject a third of all Texans to lending abuses, and they'll be subject to being taken advantage of. So those are some of the harms that'll happen if these bills get preempted.
Thanks. And so I know we've talked a lot about harmful things that are happening, or concerning things that are happening in the legislature. Is there any good news, any bills that have been adopted that could make things better, or maybe have the state step up and take some ownership of oversight?
There is good news. There are a couple of bills that I want to make everyone aware of that have been introduced in the House. House Bill 297 by Diego Bernal would take these ordinances that these 49 cities have passed, and it would adopt it into state law and make it effective statewide. And again, that doesn't say payday lenders can't operate their business, but as you mentioned, there are just some common sense restrictions and helps about the number of times that the loan can be rolled over, about what percentage has to go to principal. It would just kind of codify some of those practices into state law. And then also House Bill 2256 from Representative Turner would put a cap on the annual percentage rate for payday and auto title lending. That's something that we've really been seeking for over a decade, since 2013. That's kind of the ultimate solution. If we could get a cap, That's something the cities haven't been able to do. And so it's really better left for the state. And so that's something we're encouraging the state to pass.
Right. Thanks so much, John. And I did want to add a couple of other beneficial bills that are currently under consideration at the legislature. House Bill 3481 by Chairman Leach and its companion Senate Bill 775 by Senator Zaffarini would modernize wage garnishment protection. So this is on the other side of the debt, not just once people get trapped in debt and they default, then there can be debt collection actions against this. So this just makes sure that people don't fall into renewed poverty when there's a debt collection action filed against them. And then House Bill 4641 by Chairman Meyer and Senate Bill 836 is companion by Senator Zaffarini on the Senate side, offers really important protections for victims of financial abuse. And we'll be providing and posting more information about these good measures and hope that we can work with a lot of folks to support the good things and push back against bills that will harm our local communities.
Thank you so much, Ann and John. Anything else?
Nope, that's it for now.
Great. Well, I'm glad you guys ended with some good news, and we'll hopefully do the same in the next section, which will turn over to Ben Martin and Madison Sloan to talk about the way that preemption is going to affect evictions and ordinances that have been introduced by cities around evictions.
Great, thank you, Gabriella. I'm Maddie Sloan. I'm the director of our disaster recovery and fair housing project here at Appleseed. And two of the things we have seen in more than 15 years of this work are that where you live and where you're allowed to live is foundational to your life outcomes and determines what kind of opportunities you have, not only economically or educationally, but to safety, to physical safety and to physical health. And we have also seen over and over again how few protections renters in Texas have, whether it's in the wake of a natural disaster, when people lose their homes, sometimes illegally, whether it's around where rental housing can be built, and whether those areas are safe for people. And that work for almost as long as we've been doing it has been done with our wonderful partners at Texas Housers. So Ben, I will have you talk a little bit about Housers and what y'all do.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. I'm really happy to be here with everyone today. My name is Ben Martin. I am the research director at Texas Housers. And we've been working alongside Appleseed for longer than I've been at the organization. Anyways, Texas Housers is an organization that works to ensure that all Texans, especially low-income Texans and Texans of color, have access to safe, decent, affordable, and stable housing. We work mostly at the local and state level, although we do occasionally interface with federal agencies as well. We do a variety of activities. We're also a research-based organization. We work directly with community members, tenant leaders. One of our main projects and goals is to strengthen relationships among leaders in localities across the state to build up a stronger statewide housing justice network.
Thanks. So Ben, Gabriella covered a couple of the bills seeking to preempt local eviction protections. Why is it so urgent to fight those preemption bills? What's happening with evictions in Texas right now?
Yeah, we are in a real eviction crisis in the state of Texas. Backing up a little bit, prior to the pandemic, eviction rates were very high in the state. For many who weren't directly impacted, this was something of an invisible crisis. As the pandemic happened, though, as we got into 2020, this really became apparent, and the precarity that so many Texas households faced in terms of being on a razor's edge of losing housing stability became really apparent that was going to impact and increase the severity of the public health crisis that we were already going through. So in particular, our federal government, but also a bit at the state and local levels, our governments really attacked this problem head on during the pandemic with funding and protections for tenants. Emergency rental assistance funding through the U.S. Treasury. Our state program in Texas distributed over $2.1 billion to renters and landlords to help avoid evictions. Our state court system implemented emergency orders that helped slow down the eviction process a little bit, give tenants additional protections in order to avoid unnecessary evictions. And the court system really worked hand in hand with that additional funding to help connect tenants and landlords to available funds and resources and avoid unnecessary evictions. But that funding wasn't limitless, and those protections began to end and the funding dried up in 2022. This was at the same time that, as I hope probably everyone on this call knows, housing prices for both homeowner and renter housing in Texas and across the country skyrocketed in 2022. And so what we saw is that evictions bounced back in a big way. In 2022, we saw, as it shows on the chart here, we saw approximately, according to our analysis, over 270,000 eviction cases filed in the state of Texas. In Harris County, there were a higher number of evictions filed than the historic average for every single month of 2022. And in 2022 and 2023 now, in places like Dallas and Travis counties, we are seeing evictions roar back in a big way, and in some places exceed historic levels.
And what are the negative consequences of evictions, both for the families affected and for the communities they live in?
Yeah, so I like to characterize the harms of evictions in four ways. There are harms to the individual. So we know from research that evictions have a negative impact on future employment and financial stability, certainly future housing stability. It drastically increases the risk of homelessness and has measurable impacts on negative impacts on health and mental health. For families with children, evictions have a negative impact on educational attainment. And then at the community level, it disrupts the fabric and stability of whole communities, not just for the evicted families. And ultimately, this winds back around to the public and the taxpayer. For the subset of people who are evicted, who end up experiencing homelessness, taxpayers are responsible for paying for existing services for people who are experiencing homelessness and ultimately for rehousing. We know that it costs significantly more to rehouse someone than to help them avoid losing stable housing in the first place.
And I think it's worth noting that just having an eviction case filed against you, even if you win it, even if the case is dismissed, can end up affecting your ability to find housing for up to 7 years. It will show up on tenant screening and can really, impacts housing stability, for almost 10 years, again, even if you win the case and are not evicted. So Ben, what kind of things are cities doing to try to prevent and reduce evictions that these bills would preempt?
Yeah, so one really positive thing that's come out of the increased visibility of the harm of evictions and the crisis of evictions that happened during the pandemic is that this is, for our local leaders in particular, this is really more on the front of their mind. And we see local leaders really trying to address this problem by, matching funds that came down from the federal government, for instance, or to our topic of the day, this tool called Opportunity to Cure. And what this is local governments, some local governments in the state have implemented what's called an Opportunity to Cure. It gives tenants a window of time to pay their rent before a notice to vacate can be delivered, which triggers the formal eviction process and the harms, even if you ultimately are not evicted, the harms that Maddie was just talking about in terms of accessing stable housing in the future. So a opportunity to cure basically means your landlord tells you, hey, delivers you a notice. I'm planning to evict you. You have X number of days. For these cure periods, typically the number is kind of shaking out to 7 days. So you have 7 days, and if you don't pay your rental arrears or your back rent in 7 days, I'm going to deliver a notice to vacate and the formal eviction process will be started. But if the tenant is able to pay their back rent in that time, then it never triggers that formal eviction filing and never starts that process. So this really gives tenants an opportunity to avoid that in the first place. We've seen a fight for opportunity to cure that was successful in the city of Austin, which now has a 7-day opportunity to cure. Dallas was really ahead of the ball with a temporary cure period during the pandemic. They're now on their second temporary ordinance and are working at the local level on what number and what some of the details are that they're arriving at for a permanent ordinance. Even places like the city of San Marcos had a very generous temporary opportunity to cure during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, and as a former housing lawyer, I can say, this is really standard in most states, even states like Alabama, that Texas might compare itself to. And this is actually a very timely Lege Chat, because on Monday morning, folks really have an opportunity to oppose one of the big eviction preemption bills. And then I'll have you talk a little bit more about what folks can do to really oppose this.
Yeah, so earlier on in the webinar today, we brought up House Bill 2035. This is a bill that was filed by Representative Sloan and has a few co-authors. What this bill does is it says that local governments no longer have the ability to regulate evictions. Directly, what this would mean is that those local governments that I just mentioned that have a cure period or an opportunity to cure would go away. It would be preempted, and that other governments that are considering this would not be able to continue those deliberations. It's really important to note that 2035 is the Texas Apartment Association's #1 priority this session. What I want to note is that in Austin, in Dallas, the regional apartment associations were stakeholders and participants in the deliberation around the development of these local ordinances. This was not happening behind their back or behind closed doors. They were a part of the conversation. But really what's happened now is because they and their peers didn't like the outcome, they've escalated this to the state level and are attempting to remove local ability to narrowly tailor what a locality needs in terms of serving tenants and helping them to avoid unnecessary evictions. So 2035 is up for a hearing in the Business and Industry Committee in the House on Monday morning at 8:30 a.m. So this is really the big moment for this bill. It is possible for this bill to get voted down in committee, and that's our goal. So I do want to extend an invitation to folks on this call who are able to, especially folks who are in district with Business and Industry Committee members, to reach out to their committee members today to tell them to vote against House Bill 2035. And then my second ask is, if you're able to make it, to join us on Monday morning to testify about the harms of this bill.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you both. And I will just add, Ben, since this is being heard in the House committee, there's also an opportunity to submit written testimony at the bottom of every House committee hearing notice. So check out the link at the very bottom of the committee hearing notice for Monday at 8:30 in Business and Industry, and you'll be able to submit something written as well if you can't come to the Capitol on Monday. Anything else, Maddie and Ben?
Yeah, can I add one more thing? There
for
is kind of a third path here, and that would be a statewide opportunity to cure. Maddie mentioned that it's very common for other states in the country, even other southern states and other conservative states, to adopt a statewide opportunity to cure period. There's a bill that would do that. It's House Bill 673 from Representative Collier, which would enact a 7-day statewide opportunity to cure. So if the concern of the apartment association is that there's kind of a patchwork of regulation, and that it makes it difficult for folks in their association, there is a path where we could provide tenants this opportunity, and it would be uniform across the entire state, and that would be House Bill 673.
Great, thank you for that, Ben. And similarly, there are bills that would do some statewide work on things like rest breaks and instituting that statewide, and paid sick leave, and some of the other issues that we mentioned that could be instituted statewide, so that there is consistent regulation across the board that supports our citizens and residents. So I would like to now take the opportunity to introduce Christian Caballero, who will give you some background about how the legislative session operates for those of you who are new to it, and also to talk about some of our calls to action. So thank you, Christian.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christian Caballero. I'm the Director of Community Outreach at Texas Appleseed. I want to kind of highlight some things, especially for people that are not familiar with the legislative process, the timeline, how these bills become law, the ways that you can get involved, highlight some of the calls to action that you've already heard, and a list of resources that will be incredibly helpful for you to engage further in this legislative session. So if we can go on to the next slide, this is the timeline of how a legislative session works. Right now, we're right in the middle where you see committees. This is where bills are assigned to committees and the public hearings begin. From March through April, some bill amendments will be made by the committee members after hearing from the public. Then it'll move forward to calendars, especially on the House side. The Senate side works a little differently, but generally, if voted by the majority of the committee members, it'll move to the House and Senate floors for further action. And that's where you see from April to May, the House and Senate will have second and third readings of these bills. They'll make additional amendments. They'll have public hearings on these bills. And then they'll place a final vote on whether or not, the majority agrees to pass this into law and put it on the governor's desk for him to consider and to sign officially into law. So post-session is when that happens, when it's on the governor's desk. And if he does agree to sign it into law, it doesn't officially become law until around September. So it's quite a lengthy process. And as some of you might know, but most of you out in the general public don't know, in Texas, we have legislative sessions only every other year. This is a very short period of time where things are crunched and quickly, pushed through. And so for those of us on the advocacy side, we have to work very, very quickly in a short amount of time on bills that are potentially become laws that could affect, millions of people that live in Texas. So here's a really great graphic of just that breakdown of what I just said of how a bill becomes a law in Texas. Now we have two different houses, right? We have the House side of representatives for Texas, and then we have the Senate side. I won't go into the logistics and educate people on that, what makes those two things different, but there is a slightly different process for each of those separate houses. And so it's, first the committee, then calendars, and then it goes to a floor debate, and then it goes to the governor's desk again. So hopefully that graphic breaks it down for you a little bit better than just maybe words might do. On to the next slide. Here are some different ways that you can get involved. The most important thing that I highly recommend is joining or at least following some local advocacy groups, whether that's within your respective city or region, or even just statewide groups that keep track of policy and do a lot of advocacy work around policy. By joining and following them, you'll get regular legislative updates on what's going on at the Capitol during this legislative process. action alerts trying to mobilize people to either go to the Capitol or at least contact legislative representatives and make sure that, they're communicating, which bills are important to them and whether or not they support them or they oppose them. And then, of course, these groups will also provide advocacy tools. If you've never done advocacy before, this is a great opportunity to learn more about it and see what tools are available that you can utilize in your respective community. It's incredibly helpful. And then, of course, a list of resources are important as well. Another thing that you can do is attend events at the Capitol. If you have the privilege and also the luxury of going to the Capitol, which not everybody does, you could attend legislative briefings that are being held at the Capitol. You can go to a lobby or advocacy day that a particular advocacy group is hosting, and also rallies, right? Which I think is what the media captures most of the time are the rallies. But I think it's incredibly important, especially if you've never been part of a legislative process before, try to go to these briefings, try to learn more about how these bills become law and which bills are being highlighted, as far as level of importance and priority, especially to specific advocacy groups. It's a great way to, start getting involved in that process. Another basic way that you can get involved, especially if you can't attend the Capitol, I would say, is at the very least, contact your legislative representatives. You can call them, you can email them, you can send them letters, you can send them postcards. Or again, if you do have the privilege and luxury to go to the Capitol, you can speak with them in person, go to their offices. And even if you can't speak to the representative directly for whatever reason, they might be in a committee meeting or what have you, you can at least talk to their staff. The staff in these offices are vital, so they shouldn't be dismissed. You should take every opportunity to, bend their ear, let them know what's important to you, and urge them to, speak to the about whichever bill or whichever issue you have concern about, or that you really want them to support or oppose. Another thing is you can drop a card, you can testify and or submit public comment online. So dropping a card is basically when there's an official hearing on something, on a particular bill, there's a system where you have to be at the Capitol for this approach. You can use your laptop, you can use a tablet, but you can't use your phone for this process, and you have to be connected to the Capitol Wi-Fi for this. There's also kiosks on site that you can utilize to drop a card to basically register whether you support or oppose a particular bill that's going to be heard that day. But if you don't have the luxury of dropping a card and testifying when a bill is being heard, then at the very least, you can submit a public comment online. And I highly encourage people to do that. And the last thing that you can do at the very least is promote advocacy efforts and personal stories through media, whether that's through social media, a blog post, a newsletter, editorial, through the news or radio. I mean, these options should be utilized to the fullest so that you are not only amplifying what's going on during this legislative session, but you're urging other people to be in tune and to get more engaged and to be more aware as well. We can move on to the next slide to highlight the calls to action that were mentioned in this webinar. So some specific bills that were highlighted, that you can contact your Texas legislative representatives about are HB 2127, HB 2266, HB 2305, SB 149, SB 814, and HB 2305. And again, if you have any questions about these specific bills, not only can you look them up online on the Texas legislative website, but you can feel free to contact us, at Texas Appleseed or any of our guest speakers here to learn a little bit more about these bills and, the specific pros and cons of them. But for the most part, there's a lot of cons with these bills. And we're happy to assist and to provide information on each of these bills. And aside from contacting your legislative representatives and asking them to oppose those bills, we encourage people to show up for committee hearings. Right now, the Business and Industry Committee is meeting this Monday on April 3rd at 8:30 a.m. at the Capitol. You can drop a card, you can testify, and again, or submit public comment online opposing 2305, because that's this particular bill that's going to be heard at that committee hearing, among other bills, but that's the main one that we want to highlight for people to please, please, please try to encourage these committee members to oppose it.
And not to interrupt Christian, but I just want to make sure that we know that it's HB 2035. So sorry for the typo here, but it's HB 2035 that is being heard.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't catch that earlier. So yeah, that might be confusing, but 2035 is the bill that we encourage people to contact committee members and encourage them to oppose. And again, we'll make sure to be available to anyone that has further questions about that bill, 2035. But you can also find it on the committee hearing posting for Monday. And then at the very least, what you can do as of right now, other than those actions, is sign up for our newsletters and action alerts. That's going to be the best way to stay tuned on what's currently going on at the Capitol and what's moving at the Capitol, and how we need people to plug in during this legislative session. So you can sign up for the newsletter for Texas Appleseed. There's also the Texas Fair Lending Alliance. They have a great newsletter and they're very consistent and sending out action alerts for people. And also Texas Housers. I know if you visit their main webpage, at the very bottom, you can sign up for their newsletter as well. And let's see, what else? The next slide. Here's a list of resources that are vital and incredibly helpful. So as far as Texas Appleseed is concerned, we do have a very long list of legislative priorities. And that webpage will also hold a lot of our action alerts and any other information that is going to be useful for people during this legislative session. So highly encourage people to go to that webpage. And of course, the main pages for the Texas legislative site is going to be TLO. That's where you can find a lot of information specifically on these bills. You can also get alerts if there's any movement on bills. So you can sign up for alerts on that website. The next one is, if you don't know who your legislative representatives are, this next website is incredibly helpful, which shows, who represents me. I know a lot of people don't know and they lose track of who is, and that is a great resource as well. The next one is the Texas House Committees. This website will show the full list of committees that exist during the legislative session. And they, cover very specific areas. So you can take a view of that, see which committees resonate, with your interests and like what you want to try to keep track of, and highly recommend looking at that list of committees. The next one is public comment. So this is for people that can't necessarily go to the Capitol to drop a card and to testify in person. This is a great option for people that are remote, and you can reach out to legislative representatives about a particular bill that you're asking them to either support or oppose, or even make suggested amendments to if you're that bold and that in tune with policy. But for the most part, it's just a great opportunity to let them know whether you support it and oppose it, and encourage them to do the same. And then here we have created a guide to drop a card for a lot of people that have never been to the Capitol. They're not used to the terminology, especially because technically you're not actually dropping a card. So that confuses a lot of people. This is a great guide of what that means, what that process looks like, and the logistics of that process to drop a card at the Capitol in registering for a particular bill that's being heard, and showing whether or not you support it and oppose it. So I highly recommend people to utilize these resources. And again, if you have any questions about these resources, we're more than happy to help and assist and answer any questions that you might have. Especially for right now, I think we're going to finish off this webinar with Q&A, so we can go into Q&A if there are any questions.
And just so you know, before we jump into Q&A, SB 814, which is the companion bill to HB 2127, the Media's Death Star bill, has just been set for hearing in the Senate Business and Commerce Committee on Tuesday. So we will need a lot of opposition to that bill because it just got posted.
Thank you for that, Gabriella. So it looks like we have a couple of questions here. We've already answered one online in particular to what committee is HB 2035 being heard on Monday. Again, that's going to be heard on the Business and Industry Committee. So please look up that committee. They have a long list of other bills they're going to be hearing that same day. I know that, you know, Texas Appleseed and some other partners of ours, we actually have some other bills on our radar that we're probably going to try to speak on Monday as well. But yes, it's going to be the Business and Industry Committee. Another question is, what is the advocacy strategy on the Death Star bill, House Bill 2127 and Senate Bill 814? And I'm going to give this to our policy experts to answer.
I'm going to call on Bree Gordley and say, Bree, do you and Ann have specific thoughts on this?
Absolutely. And John has been a really big part in our opposition to House Bill 2127 and the companion Senate Bill 814. We've seen bills like this in many previous sessions, and we're so grateful to have such a strong group of stakeholders and advocates to speak out. So we are probably annoyingly sending out numerous action alerts on social media. So Christian mentioned the Texas Fair Lending Alliance. We have a listserv where we send out updates about what's going on this legislative session. And so we are blowing up the listserv, constantly sending out alerts. This is what this bill does. And we're providing Texans, individuals, other consumer advocates, stakeholders, numbers, contact information for all of the committee members so that they can go ahead and quickly submit comments, quickly call their representatives to speak out against these really bad preemption bills. We also, in addition to meeting with offices, because we do feel it is important to go to the senator or the representative and express our concerns, we are encouraging others to do the same. And we are also, like this webinar, hosting information sessions about the harms of these preemption bills and how they're impacting our communities. We're rallying with our stakeholders like John, like AARP, to talk about how these preemption bills are going to harm other different vulnerable groups. And then we are rallying our partners in the media to put out information, to put out articles and resources. And, you know, thankfully, people really care about this issue. And we'll get people that email Ann or myself directly saying, hey, I live in XYZ. How can I come provide testimony? How can I support? And it's also really great that we're a part of a coalition called the Coalition Against State Interference, where we're always making sure that we're surveilling these types of preemption bills so that we can come up with a strategy amongst different groups. Because for our organization, we're really concerned about the payday and auto title lending ordinances, but there are many other local ordinances that would be preempted by this bill. And so there's a lot of other stakeholders out there that care for numerous reasons. And so because we have so much interest and so much power in our advocacy, we're able to raise a lot of support, rally, talk to different constituents, talk to different representatives and say, here are a list of concerns that we have. And so a lot of it's word of mouth. A lot of it is through technology, through emails. I post incessantly on social media about our concerns, just hoping that people will understand how imperative it is for us to speak out against these bills. And as always, Appleseed, John, other groups are at the Capitol testifying in opposition, and we'll be doing so next week as well.
And Brianna, would you just introduce yourself to everyone?
Oh, my goodness. I'm so sorry. My name is Brianna Gordley. I work at Texas Appleseed. I work with Ann, who just presented on the Fair Financial Services Project. And so we've been working really hard this session to ensure that our voices are heard and that, you know, our members, you all know that these bills are an overreach and they're an assault on local government. And so we're here to fight against them. Sorry about that. Thanks, Gabriella.
Thank you.
All right, the next question, which also looks like it was answered via Zoom, is have you found that there is a most effective way to contact legislators, email versus phone call? And it was answered that any contact is great, but calling is particularly effective. It's tougher to ignore a ringing phone than an email box, which I say is definitely true. You know, having the phones ringing nonstop definitely grabs people's attention. But I will say it's also great to email as well. I say pair the two up. What I like to do is I like to email them first, and I like to follow it up with a phone call. And I think the email is important because it's traceable and you can use it as reference when you're calling them. You know, you can let them know, hey, I just sent you an email earlier. I mentioned, you know, this particular bill, you know, highlight some of the points, the main points that were in that email that you sent them. And if they're able to discuss it at all. I think pairing the two together is incredibly helpful. All right, another question, and this has not been answered yet, is while total destruction, also known as, the Luke Skywalker, there's a lot of Star Wars references here, I'm liking it. While total destruction would be fantastic, is there a backup strategy of stripping certain sections of it? Okay, stripping, got it. I'm gonna go back to our policy experts on that one.
Yeah,
see, is that like in a particular bill that you're talking about?
I think I have an idea. So Gabriella talked about House Bill 2127, which is the Death Star bill, and it addresses certain sections of code. And so Gabriella also mentioned that when the hearing was heard several weeks ago, we learned that 2 sections of code were added. And so I believe the question is, and have we gone on other strategies to try and address those sections? We absolutely have. Ideally, we would like the bill to not go through, to not preempt any section of code, but we also have had meetings with the author of the bill about removing the finance code, which would impact the ordinances. So we've tried to strategize in a lot of different ways. Again, ideally, we would not want this bill to move forward. We want governments and local governments to have power, but we're also ensuring, hey, is there conversations where we could remove the finance code or could include a carve out for the payday and auto title lending ordinances?
And Ben, I think you also had a response to this question.
Yeah, I didn't mention it earlier, but the Death Star bill, if it were to pass with the property code in it, it would also preempt local eviction regulation like an opportunity to cure. So unfortunately, we're fighting this opportunity to cure battle on multiple fronts. So for us, for that priority, stripping the property code back out of the bill would be a priority from that perspective.
All right, thank you so much, you all, for answering those questions. One other question that we have from Zoom is also, how would you all say is the best way to set up a meeting with a legislator? Is it better to just show up and talk with whichever staff member is available? And have you found it's more worth the time to talk to people who already may agree? Or is it better to go specifically to the legislators that are on the committee, but that are more likely to disagree? I'll answer this, but I'd love to hear what our policy experts that are spending a lot of time at the Capitol, what they have to say as well. So generally, my opinion, as far as community outreach is concerned, I think that, let's say there's a lot of questions in this one question. I think talk to whoever you can, and you don't necessarily have to schedule a meeting. In fact, trying to schedule a meeting is probably not only going to be difficult, but it probably won't play out the way that you hope. So let's say, like, even if you got to schedule a meeting with the legislator, the chances of that legislator being available at that said day and time is probably not going to happen. You're most likely going to be left with whatever staff person is available, especially whatever staff person specializes in a particular area. Because I know a lot of these legislative offices, they have staff members that will be more so experts on like fair housing, right? For example, or ones that are experts when it comes to for financial services and access. And so it just depends on the staff member. But I think so long as you're trying to get someone's ear and make sure that, you know, they're relaying that information and that conversation to the legislative representative. And I would say that while it's always great to talk to legislative representatives that will be agreeable, I think it's equally, if not more important, to talk to legislative representatives that might differ and, you know, might disagree with you. But at the very least, having those conversations where, you know, both sides can be heard and they're exposed to information and perspective that they otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. And of course, I think at the end of the day, especially in this part of session where the committee meetings are going on, I think it's even more important right now that you are targeting committee members that are actively hearing and voting on bills. I think when it gets later on in session, when it starts reaching the House and Senate floor, and there's a lot of legislative representatives that are going to be putting on a final vote on a lot of these bills, then you can reach out to as many legislative representatives, including your own respective legislative representative from your own area, and try to, you know, encourage them to, you know, support or oppose a certain bill. But right now, during this committee process, I highly recommend reaching out and targeting committee members specifically. But yes, I would like other people to add to that and, you know, answer it and give additional perspective to these questions.
I want to add just a small thing on that. I would encourage folks that are reaching out to committee members in particular not to make assumptions about what committee members might agree or disagree. It is not harmful to talk to a committee member that you think is already going to be supportive of the cause that you're talking to them on, because they either might surprise you and not vote aligned with what you thought they would, or it just might not be a priority for them. And so you speaking to them raises it in the priority list in their mind. And then kind of in a similar way, legislators that you imagine might disagree with you, you never know. There are some legislators that I'm working with this session that I'm very surprised that we're finding common ground on. And so keeping an open mind and really listening to what members and staff are saying to you about a particular issue is really important.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I put this in my response on the Q&A, but I would say at the committee level, committee members are key. And as it goes into the House or the Senate, your member is key. Speaking to their constituents is invaluable, and hearing from their constituents, especially in mass, is invaluable to making somebody change their mind if they were already kind of dug in. So that's the last thing I will leave you with.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions from Facebook or Zoom. So I think we can safely close this webinar off. We don't need to keep people longer on here than needed. Here's a list of our contact information. Everybody that has spoken during this webinar, I highly encourage you all to reach out to us. You can also follow us on social media. You know, we try to, you know, keep a lot of our action alerts and legislative updates on social media as well. And again, if you have any questions or you need additional resources or guidance at all during this legislative session, especially in regards to preemption bills, we're happy to help and we're happy to assist. So thank you all for joining, and until next time, stay tuned.